takes a while for the team to get to consensus around what the different impact ratings are and what they mean. We rated likelihood and impact each on a 5-point scale, so very high, high, medium, low, and very low. So each of those we had the 5-point scale. And we did have defined criteria for what fit into each point on that scale. But still, you struggle with adjusting the criteria and internalizing the criteria too, especially with impact. Now, another thing that happens as you go through and do the assessment of the risk items is that you will identify duplicates. And duplicates will happen. Two people have the same idea. Now, in the big group brainstorming session, duplicates happen less. In the sequence of one-on-one interviews, though, I should mention this, that you will tend to get a fairly significant number of duplicates as you get to the end of the interviews. And that's actually a good thing, because that indicates that the people that you've talked to collectively have run out of ideas. And you want to, if you're doing the interview approach, you want to continue to do the interviews until you reach that point of convergence where you are getting a lot of duplicates from people that you talk to. But in the group brainstorming, if you identify a duplicate, you can just say, okay, well, this is a dupe of another one. Now, usually I want to capture that in my documentation, but I don't want to count it as a separate risk item. And if there are overlapping risk items, then you can reword them, since you have the stakeholders in the room, and reword them to be non-overlapping. So at the end of this overall session, we have 92 risk items that we have identified, and 40% of those have been rated. And we've come to sort of a meeting of the minds, as it were, across the stakeholders about how to rate these risk items, how to assign the likelihood and impact values. So after the session, the test manager went off on the next day and spent some time working one-on-one with some of the other participants to finalize the ratings. And that can happen. That's not a big disaster. If you don't finish all of the ratings in the brainstorming session, at least you should have achieved a consensus about what the different ratings mean, and kind of struggle with that a little bit. So on this slide, you see an excerpt. It was basically what the documents look like, or document look like, at the end of that day session. So I want to point out a few key things here. I'm going to leave aside this header at the top. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. Now let me point out, here's the category. So the category of functionality here, and we have, as I said, about 20 or so other categories that are of interest. And every risk item has a risk ID number, which we can use for traceability in the test management system, whatever test management system we use. So 1.001 is Unix system services compatibility issues. Okay? And so that's a risk item. That's been assessed as a 4, which is low likelihood. We use a descending scale where the smaller numbers, 1, 2, were at the higher end of the scale, and the bigger numbers, 4 and 5, were at the lower end of the scale, with 3 in the middle. So we get, this is a very low, or excuse me, a low likelihood, and a 3 impact, so that's a medium impact. And now, based on those two ratings, likelihood and impact, we calculate an aggregate measure of risk by multiplying those two things together. So 4 times 3 is 12. And I'm calling that the risk priority number, RPN. It's an acronym that you'll see me using as I go along here. And so the RPN, risk priority number, is, as I said, the aggregate level of risk, or aggregate metric of risk for the risk item, and that's going to drive sequencing of the tests that relate to that risk item, and it's going to drive triage of tests, if necessary, that are related to that risk item. And it's also going to be used to determine the extent of testing through a mechanism that I'm going to show you a little bit later. Now, take a look at this guy here, 1.005, new commands do not function. Now you see here we get TBD, TBD, and of course the pound sign here where the calculation didn't work because it tried to calculate multiplying two strings together. TBD meaning to be determined. As we got a note to Jim here, Jim Castee, the test manager in charge of this, might need to break this out for each new command. So Jim's got an action item to go off and think about this and see if it needs to be broken out, and if it does, then we're going to have different likelihood and impact ratings for each one of those. So that's how this works. Now you can see down here at the bottom, we got a place to capture the project risk, the byproducts that we identified. So that's in the template, and then miscellaneous, any other issues that come up, we captured there. And then the risk levels and the extent of testing are defined in this worksheet. So that what a very high impact versus a high impact versus a medium impact versus a low impact versus a very low impact means it's defined in there. And then the mapping from the RPN to the extent of testing is also defined in that other worksheet. So this is pretty much a comprehensive collection of the information. So that's where we are at the end of the session. Now, once Jim finished getting the ratings done, the risk priority number, or RPN, is now calculated for each item based on that formula. And as I said, the likelihood and impact are rated on a 5-point scale, so we've got risk priority numbers ranging from 1 to 25. And because I used a descending scale, where the larger numbers are the smaller risk, then for the risk priority number, 1 is the most risky. It's very likely to happen, and when it happens, it's going to be very bad, basically. And 25 is the least risky. It's very unlikely, and even if it did happen, odds are real good. Nobody would care. Now, obviously, since so much is dependent on these ratings being right, the sequencing of the tests, the allocation of effort, the triage of the tests if need be, the reporting of the results, we need to make sure that these assessments are correct. So we need to look at these assessments and make sure they are correct. And one of the things that can go wrong, frequently does go wrong to some extent, it's not a big deal, but it's a problem that needs to be identified and solved, is clumping of the risk ratings. So basically, clumping is when you have a lot of the risk items having a single risk rating, particularly one that's kind of shoved to one side or the other of the distribution. Now, that can occur for a number of reasons. There are a couple that are particularly common. One is the skewing of the impact. So when the people involved in doing the risk assessment, when they look at the risk item, say, oh, you know, this is something really horrible could happen if that happened, and so, you know, it's a very high impact, and then pretty quick everything starts being a very high impact. A lot of times that's happening because people are basing their ratings on worst case possible outcomes. You want to remember when you're rating the impact to think about what's the most likely typical kind of production problem, field failure we get related to this risk item. So, you know, for example, if we're talking about system response too slowly to user input, don't think about the most catastrophic performance problem you could possibly have. You know, think about, well, when we have that kind of